also live on the broadcast right now.
Oh, good. Sounds good. Good to
So you're
know.
warned.
All right.
Vocalizations could show up.
That sounds good. I won't say anything of sort. Show looks good.
Yeah.
I'm pretty excited.
Yeah.
It's just me tonight. Joe's not feeling up to it. She's been feeling really fatigued, so it's like, I should probably stay home. Yes, you should.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Shalaya Marsh. I'm the gallery manager here at the Creative Arts Center. And welcome back to the School of Art and Design Visiting Artist Lecture Series. It's nice to have you all here both in person and streaming. I want to thank the Myers Foundation for continued support of both our exhibitions and this lecture series, and give you a few reminders. Please, if you're in person here, can you take this time to silence your cell phones? I also want to thank Jamie and Gabe, our graduate assistants, who helped install the exhibition in the gallery. They did a really wonderful job, and I hope you join us in the gallery after the talk for a reception and a live performance by artist Quinn Hunter, whose works are in the exhibition. Also, save the date for our next opening reception, which is for the outdoor sculpture tour. It'll be October 14th at 5 p.m. outside of the CCAC lobby. So join us for that. It'll be really a wonderful event as well. For those of you who are live streaming, there is a link to Sarah Rowe's video. If you could open that now in your browser, that will help you to follow along with us here in Block Hall. So it's really a pleasure to be able to introduce you to Brie Murphy and Eric Zahn, who curated the current exhibition in the Maceros Gallery. Brie is an interdisciplinary artist who uses digital technologies in combination with ceramics to talk about American identity. She received a BFA from the State University of New York at New Paltz and an MFA from Ohio University. And is currently the digital fabrications technician at Colorado State University. Eric Zahn is currently the ceramics studio tech at Maryland Institute College of Art. He utilizes ceramic object making in his work, but also performance and installation. Both have works upstairs in the gallery on display, and they curated this exhibition and are going to talk about that today. Eric's work investigates the connection between systematic politics and our own values. He received a bachelor's degree from Bowling Green State University and also an MFA in ceramics from the Ohio University, where he and Brie met and began collaborating on this project, American Artifacts. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Brie and Eric to talk with you tonight.
The exhibition, American Artifacts, was conceived amidst a great divide in our society, historically, but most vividly within the last 5 years. The gap between those who wish for progression of our nation through unity and those who wish to digress into the darker moments of our past. This gap grows fast and threatens to swallow us all. Misinformation, vitriol, and hate have spread so rapidly, and the debate about our country's narratives have come to the forefront. In this chaos of values, there has opened a referendum on our history. The idea that the past stays in the past has been found to be a farce of convenience for the power structures of this country.
All right, thank you all so much for being here. It's a real honor to have this show at West Virginia University, and we want to extend a huge thanks to Shalaya and everyone for bringing us out here. This is the first physical realization of American Artifacts following multiple delays, of course, due to the COVID pandemic. The first opening was slated for the 2020 NCECA conference in Richmond, Virginia, in March. So when we were putting together the idea for this show, it was with an upcoming election in mind, and it was in Richmond, right, the seat of the former Confederacy. So the curatorial vision, I don't think, has lost any of its potency in that time span, but if anyone is interested in curating, I think site and context are an important consideration, and the origin story for the show is still pretty interesting. So that's sort of where we started. The purpose of our talk tonight is to highlight the work of each of the 7 artists in the show and give a little more context for each of their respective bodies of work. We will first give a little brief historical framework for the curatorial premise of American artifacts, then talk about each artist, and then have some time at the end for questions. I want to add that some of the research for the show's concept was directly inspired by the artists that we wanted to work with. For example, Quinn Hunter's work taught me so much about plantations and antebellum weddings, but more on that shortly. Okay, take it away, Eric.
Thank you, Brie. This potentially unsuspecting object, right, standard teapot, really acts as evidence of our nation's infancy. In 1767, the Stamp Act, which imposed taxation upon all printed materials, right, that's playing cards and any sort of brochures, was repealed by the Crown. Right, under pressure from the possibility of violent revolt, the Crown rescinded this taxation. These teapots were produced for sale in the colonies as a celebratory commemoration, made by English potters. It is a poignant coincidence that just years later, the Townshend Act taxing tea would become the impetus for secession.
All right, these are a little more contemporary version of political pottery made by the Frankoma Pottery in Oklahoma, starting in 1968, Republican elephants only. And then starting in 1975, they made some donkeys too, to appeal to a larger audience. They still release a new edition every year with a special color of the year, and there's a little screen grab for you. In 2015, the glaze color is Grand Canyon.
Ooh,
Great, thank you, Eric. These are instances of ways that the domestic object becomes a vehicle for politics and national identity building. Collectible commodities that are widely available bring art objects into economic spaces that most folks can afford. And you can find these sorts of commemorative objects on eBay, garage sailing, or in any thrift store. The Statue of Liberty is one of the most recognizable symbols in our American schema, yet history has a strange way of distorting or co-opting its original intention. This is particularly evident in recent changes to immigration policy, which would have walls built up on borders and keep people out. Despite the off-sided words in the New Colossus poem, "Give me your tired, give me your poor," a poem written by Emma Lazarus to help raise funds for its completion, which is now inscribed inside the pedestal. This is Nottoway Plantation, the largest extant antebellum plantation, which, despite being the site of a brutal past for enslaved black human beings, exists today as a resort where you can live out your fantasy Southern wedding. Hunter's work is a direct challenge to the ways a history of violence has been erased in these places, covered with a high-gloss band-aid of antebellum fantasy that disregards generations of pain. We have not yet seen the sorts of reckonings in these spaces that we have in, say, Confederate monuments, but Hunter's work is certainly a spark that could get us closer.
On that note, this Confederate monument to General Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, has for generations been a reminder of the deep trauma and tragedy of the Civil War, a war waged to maintain the economic stature of white supremacist South. You know, while our tragic and despicable histories, they remain in the objects we produce, inevitably. And there's value in remembering those atrocities. I think a removing of those symbols, right, an appropriate placement of those is crucial to be out of the public space of monument and is vital to the recovery of our nation. While so many of the objects that we've shown already so far are explicitly tied to the history of our nation, there are also nuanced ways in which our personal histories and the personal histories of those who came before us translate into microcosms of greater systemic histories. This pot, produced by David Drake, a person who was formerly enslaved, is a great example of this. The individual experience of the literate and skilled formerly enslaved man expands out the representation of will and fortitude of a people coming out of enslavement. And on this note of kind of personal histories, personal narratives existing as a greater kind of point of history and archive, I'd like to introduce our first artist, Rahala Filsufi. Rahala is an artist and educator. She's received a number of grants and awards, and she is currently the assistant professor of ceramics in the Department of Art at Vanderbilt University. Rahala's practice adopts a wide range of aesthetic and conceptual models through which she speaks on place, identity, ownership, and borders. In this work, Bite, which can be seen in the exhibition, Rahala has dug clay from around the country, acknowledging the historical context of the land she uses. Into this clay, ancestral grounds stolen from indigenous peoples, she imposes her own identity, while with the impressions of her bite. Through this act, she is forever occupying American soil. By leaving this mark of her physical body, she directs a new narrative for American history. This process is a visceral and forceful act that requires the audience to ask, whose earth is this? Whose history does it hold? And what narratives can it carry into the future? In the case of Bite, it is one of an immigrant, one of a woman, one of power and agency in the face of unceasing rhetorical violence against other people. Utilizing multimedia, poetry, ceramics, and sight, Rahala's work traverses the ubiquity of human experience, which is inherently unbound by the delineations history and geography have placed upon us. This leaves the audience feeling a sense of honesty and perspective. This installation, Asymmetrical Despondency, acts as a poignant comparison between women of two cultures, a poem of trauma and desperation recited in her two home tongues. As one approaches the work, the muffled tones of a woman's voice are heard emanating from each of the vessels. By uncovering a jar, the audience hears the poem clearly, feeling a sense of understanding or uncertainty, depending on the language that is recited, though the content is the same. Deeply informed by her experience as an itinerant artist, Rahala contends with the socio-political in nuanced ways. Her subtlety reflects the complexity of being an immigrant in America today and touches on how easy it can be to other those who are ethnically and culturally different from us. However, at the core of her work is the desire to bring a connection and understanding. This piece, Imagined Boundaries, did just that. Through a pair of concurrent exhibitions, one held in Tehran and one held in Florida, Rahala established a unassuming connection between two peoples. As one experienced this work, they may have noticed another peering through the silhouettes of the vessel forms. Those in Iran seeing those in America, in Florida, they would see Iranians. While some may feel an aversion to being seen, others feel a deep impulse to stare back into the gaze, forcing each to consider who the other is, what their life may be like, and all the while engaging in the same experience together. This group of work exemplifies the values at the heart of Filsufi's practice: hope, connection, and the belief that at the core of ourselves, we are closer together than we are separate. At this turning point in history, when vitriol and divisiveness battle our better sensibilities, Rahala's work acts as a counter-narrative that might endure beyond its time.
All right, Quinn Alexandria Hunter is a sculptor and performance artist originally from North Carolina. She is currently based in Detroit, Michigan, where she works and teaches at Wayne State University. Quinn's work interrogates erasure throughout history of spaces, specifically in relationship to the Black female body in our contemporary American landscape. The work pictured here, Foundations, is a durational performance that Quinn will be performing immediately following this lecture, so we can all go over together. Don't miss it. Negotiations Between the World and Me are a series of woven tapestries made from artificial hair inclusions and mirror the often unseen skilled labor performed by Black women. A crucial element of this work is time, and as indicated in the titles, 32 hours and 34 hours of negotiation between the world and me, both of which are on display here in the gallery. The investment of time creating the work reflects the investments made on a routine maintenance by Black women and alludes to the ways communities and relationships are formed around the ritual of hair care. Hair as a material, and specifically artificial hair weave, carries immense social and political implications, as we are reminded of unequal expectations for Black people in terms of beauty standards and economics or professionalism in the workplace. Her pattern choices range from more simplistic rows, which could be read as crop patterns, to more specific organic shapes, which could be cotton dangling from a plant, or even strange fruit. In Beauty is Pain, the familial bonds around hair care are represented through the use of her grandmother's hot combs as a process for mark making on fabric. The heirloom of the hot comb itself carries a deep history that is both intensely personal and symbolic of cultural practice. The transference across generations that upholds history, it is wielded here to create a new artifact that makes permanent years of labor and expectation. This work, and I love that it is shown with the actual hot combs, offers an intimate glimpse into the lives of Black women that deserves preservation. This is done here by honoring the heirloom for what it was and transforming and revitalizing it in the contemporary moment to serve the purpose of record maker. Although this piece isn't in American Artifacts, it is a fabulous example of the spirit of the show, which celebrates an authentic piece of history alongside an artist's interpretation of that history. This is an installation view of the work I Hear You Now, I See You Then. In this series, Hunter is directly confronting the erasure of American slavery and the associated historical pain from sites such as Nottoway Plantation. As I discussed earlier in the historical backing for the show, modern uses of former sites of enslavement serve to gloss over the pain and suffering of Black bodies that lived, worked, and died in favor of glamorous Gone with the Wind style weddings and parties. Each set of rug and chandelier represent a different plantation that still operates today as a wedding venue. I chose this shot in particular to help communicate the scale. The rugs and chandeliers are large and connote a certain opulence associated with the luxury items, as well as to show the shadows cast on the wall by the chandeliers, which create an immersive and haunting environment. Finally, the chandeliers themselves, and there is one upstairs in the gallery, they're constructed with hair weave. They offer the starkest contrast with the objects they reference. Instead of rich metals and crystals, which lightly reflect and bounce light around, these materials are replaced with opaque braids which obfuscate and distort the light, creating barred patterns that envelop the space. The heaviness of the hair feels authentic, and we are forced to contend with what was an ornate fixture meant to convey opulence and beauty for the reality of what plantations were and the airbrush legacy that lingers there.
Larry Buller is an artist educator who lives and works in Nebraska. After receiving his bachelor's degree of fine art, he taught at public school for over 20 years. Sounds like a labor of love. Larry has been an artist in residence at Anderson Ranch in Snowmass, Colorado, as well as Zentrum für Keramika in Berlin. He has also held teaching positions at University of Nebraska-Lincoln in design and ceramics. Upon first glance, Larry's work engages with the traditions of kitsch and ornament in ceramics. Bold and overt decoration, dialed-up tchotchke stylization. This stylization reaches for fine taste while maybe trying a bit too hard. They're loud in their presence, but also relegated and confined to the over-embellished, so relegated and confined to the over-embellished as to be nearly dismissed as decorative. This is the case for the piece in the exhibition, Elysium. The work revels in opulence with its floral pattern decals and gold luster, which feels at home in the context of the included religious imagery. Two figurines of Mary flanking a classical bust form decorated with a representation of Christ. The altered bust, however, wearing a headgear so often associated with BDSM, becomes a subversive nod to the audience. Emblazoned with its title, Elysium, presents to its viewer the binary of the sacred and profane. In doing so, Larry is also asking us as audience to reflect on the influence of the conservative Christian morals Western culture has placed upon its people. Is heaven found strictly within the confines of religious dogma, or is there a back door through corporeal pleasure? This is the power of the work. In its firm planting within the realm of domestic decor and sacred object that exude homoeroticism. Larry's pieces offer a platform to question societal norms. This interplay between saccharine palatability and content that has been deemed more devious by American society interrogates our relationship to queer culture. Not only does this work articulate the influence of Christianity in determining what is part of polite society, but also on the fraught personal histories of gay men and the narratives that in the past they were required to perform. This assortment of objects from Buller's show Domestic Curiosities feels in many ways like a collection of mementos, the artifacts of familial manhood passed down from generation to generation. But again, this cursory assumption is undermined by the inclusion of subtle eroticism and jarring comparisons. While these speculative histories remain a theme for his work, Larry also confronts the systemic political terrain of homosexuality in America. While these issues of today's climate crowd our memory, the legalization of gay marriage remains a recent advancement in our nation. With this piece, Salt and Pepper Set, Buller reminds us of the victory of this victory and firmly plants it in the lineage of ceramic object as a tool for historical maintenance. The Salt and Pepper Set is known as a traditional wedding gift, providing luck and prosperity to the new couple, that they should never be without food. Vintage examples of these sets often feature small bride and groom figurines. With this set, he is co-opting tradition, shifting its value to what may have previously been thought uncouth, right? The subtle addition of horns on the figurines and the prominent cock in the middle, Larry ensures that history of same-sex marriage, having been so vehemently qualified as deviant, is not forgotten. The last two works of Larry's operate as iconization and commemoration of homoeroticism in gay culture. Diptych, a set of two familiar yet unidentifiable sexual objects, seems almost as relics, treated and exhibited with great care and honor. Placed in a field of floral pattern and haloed in a golden frame, this work again brings to mind the contention between sacred and profane. In their abstraction, they become almost contemplative objects. The series of plate tips its hat to the tradition of commemorative tableware, at once precious and negatable at the same time. As many of us have seen, commemorative plates marking important moments often end up displaced into the world of dusty boxes and thrift shops, their identity marking a monumental event superseded by a short memory and the consumer's hoard. These plates utilize a facade of the overproduced and underappreciated, but within them lies a thoughtful and considered conversation of homoeroticism, questioning the historical influence that have played a role in formation and categorization as a taboo. Like much of Larry's work, these plates ask us to look into the ever-evolving nature of America's views on gay sexuality as transgressive and begin to open the door to an honest discourse of the intimate relationships of gay men.
Sarah Rowe is a multimedia artist based in Omaha, Nebraska. Her work opens cross-cultural dialogues by utilizing methods of painting, casting, fiber arts, performance, and Native American ceremony in unconventional ways. Rowe's work is participatory, a call to action, and reimagines traditional Native American symbology to fit the narrative of today's global landscape. The work on display in the gallery, Tea Ceremony, is a series of video clips that show the mingling of tea leaves, flowers, and crude oil. It is an evolving series that has taken the form of live performance, sculpture, and now video. The work began in 2017 in response to a visit to Standing Rock Reservation during the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. Rowe spent time there and shared that she dreamt that she was turning on the faucet to make tea for herself and her daughter, a daily ritual for the two of them, but when the faucet opened, crude oil instead of water poured out. This powerful symbolism perfectly summarizes the activism that is so ingrained in Rowe's work and the desire to start a meaningful conversation about what we must do to protect our water and earth. So now I'd like to play for you a short clip of an earlier iteration of Tea Ceremony, which was performed in February of 2017 in Lincoln, Nebraska during the Dakota Access Pipeline protest at a solo show called Indian Time. So you can, and if you're streaming, now would be the time to head over to YouTube and watch that clip. So I was present for that performance. Sarah was beating a drum. Participants in the gallery were invited to pinch a small amount of chamomile tea into a teacup, receive a pour of crude oil into their cup. The most unexpected sensation was the sting of the crude oil in your nose. It quickly wiped out the sweet, tender smell of chamomile. You then carried the cup to a pedestal and placed it on a saucer. And then the room was finally cleansed with sage. Sarah's practice encompasses a wide range of media, including painting. Rowe says, "My work draws from the energy of Heyoka, the sacred clown of the Lakota. I believe humor and play help form connections across different backgrounds and perspectives, creating a more inviting world. Art creates a space of collective healing, and I share that space through collaborations with schools, shelters, rehabilitation centers, and nonprofits across the country. Storytelling and processes based on play and experimentation are key to developing engaging work and dynamic conversation."
Bel Pilar Fleming is an artist primarily working within printmaking and textile traditions. She resides and makes art in Colorado, where she serves in the role of academic success coordinator at Colorado State University. Bel Pilar's practice is a thorough investigation, a deconstruction and reassembling of histories that have been overlooked, miscategorized, and rejected. Our past and present can only endure through a genuine effort to not only document, but also archive in a way that is accessible and without bias. Fleming's work in this exhibition operates to engage in this process while interrogating the use of women as image, as symbol, without acknowledgement of women as individuals. The monument has for so long stood as a tool of remembrance and honor, great men having done great deeds to the great approval of society. Women have, however, had their forms co-opted. The idea of the feminine utilized only to serve as a symbolic representation. Bel Pilar's works from her Joyful Disturbances series bring to the forefront this observation. The penultimate ideals of our country, the foundational stones on which this great experiment are built, liberty and justice, are cast into the human mold. But the great ladies of our nation stand alone without identity. Fleming distorts the images of these symbols, shifting their space with glitching alterations, and in doing so reveals a quilt-like patchwork of uncertain space behind it. It feels like an opening up, a revealing of the possibility of truth behind the broad strokes of American exceptionalism. Within the context of her wider body of work, the question I am confronted with through Bel Pilar's dismantling in Joyful Disturbances is why and how we can appropriate the form of women in service of this country, while great women, those who have done great deeds to the great benefit of society, are left without monumental acknowledgement. This question is inevitably connected to the idea of remembrance and the cultural catalog. The empty space in the archive. Fleming approaches the space as well within the realm of queer identity. The narratives of homosexuality and queerness have been discarded or undocumented for much of recent history. Out of fear, out of inhumanity, and out of hate, the gatekeepers of personal and cultural information have chosen to neglect the stories of the queer community. Bel Pilar addresses this lack, building a collection of histories through research and making. In this series of works from her exhibition, Something in the Hand, Bel Pilar worked closely with the Ohio Lesbian Archive, parsing through the limited materials that have been collected through the years. In an effort to continue this lineage of documentation, she conducted a series of interviews with queer women of Southern Ohio. The transcripts of these conversations were then donated back to the archive, augmenting and bolstering the collection through the social practice element, creating a more full history of queer identity formation in the region. In conjunction with those interviews, Bel Pilar also was growing the wider archive of queer history through traditional art-making modes, creating some of these images with various printmaking techniques. Others, however, were assembled with what would traditionally be considered feminine craft processes. Sewing, quilting, and embroidery form and embellish these works. Engaging with these modes of woman's work, right, She's inserting these pieces not only into the wider discourse of queer cultural production in America, but similarly referencing the sentimental patchwork quilt, mothers loving her pair on worn clothing. These pieces become socio-political commentary within the contemporary context, while creating and occupying space within the realm of national artifact, building a scaffold for future generations on which they might discover their identity in an environment of personal truth, love, and connection.
Well, look at that. All right, we got a few minutes left. We'll talk about our work.
You might note, we aren't reading anymore.
Yeah. All right, so this is Unfounded Madison. This is one of 3 busts. This is the only one that's here for the American Artifacts exhibition. But this was a series of work I did in 2020 where I took 3D scans that were open source, available on the internet of Houdon's original busts of American presidents, specifically the founding fathers, and print them using a clay 3D printer that I built. And then, of course, they've been surfaced very specifically using patriotic color scheme, but in order to create an alternative narrative. So before they were printed, they were also slightly edited. Their poses slightly downward looking to encourage the sort of droopiness that you see, which is a direct product of the 3D printing process. So I let the process do a lot of the work for me in terms of developing this sort of melancholic, unraveling sort of aesthetic. The work being a direct examination of the foundations of our country and the men who are memorialized and credited for said. So here's the third one, Jefferson, and alongside these pieces was also this piece, which is called a Declaration for the United States of America. There's a detail for it, and in which I went into the original declaration and made some edits. So I updated it essentially for what was at the time 2018, but as a queer person, you know, understanding that declaration, that document was written with a certain demographic of person in mind, right? So going back into that document and treating it as a living document, thereby claiming it for everyone. And so it's a handwritten interpolation with my very slight adjustments. But I think it's important to point out with my work too that it's not a simple critique, right? It's not just a sort of negative view of the founders, because there is a lot that I'm very grateful and proud of in terms of being American, right? So it's in terms of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. There's a lot of hope in the work and reverence, right? So, but it is tempered with criticism and an ask for some updating. With that, also, there's these pieces that are in the show. There are 3 postcards, and they are actual postcards that I found and then redacted, specifically on the subject of Mount Rushmore. Last year, I lived in North Dakota, and that was being in that space with a lot of stolen land. I mean, our whole country is on stolen land, right? But this sort of very plain example of white supremacy and the taking of the Black Hills and carving these giant white guys in the side of it, right? So, so this was an examination of that and redacting any of the information that referred to after the Black Hills had been carved into. And you'll see the other 2 on display in the gallery. And moving right along, Eric, go ahead.
Excellent. We've had a tough couple of years, right? A lot of my work is very centered around the last 2 years and kind of topical events that have happened. You know, namely, I would say political upheaval and our great and ever-continuing pandemic. This work here is a performance I did recently, about, well, I guess not anymore, 6 months ago, 7 months ago. And, you know, I had seen this image of, or I had seen this sign on the side of the road, right? All these big letters spelling out, heroes work here. Who's seen a sign that said, heroes work here, essential workers are heroes, right? A lot of us. Except in this kind of large lawn sign, someone had stolen the W and the R. And it felt very poignant to me. You know, I think there were a vast number of people who were kind of lauded as heroes, right? You know, proclamations from the rooftops about how wonderful all these people who were working during the pandemic were. All the while, they were getting COVID, they were getting sick, they were dying. On top of that, people were losing their jobs, even as essential workers. Healthcare workers were having their pay cut. And, you know, I thought there was a huge discrepancy, right, between those two things. This idea of the people who serve us and help keep us safe and healthy and fed being heroes, and the fact that we're kind of leaving them out out to dry. So with this work specifically, I was kind of parsing through this pile of clay. This clay had been embedded with map pins, small pins. And I felt that, like, as I was kind of operating through this clay and getting pricked inevitably by these pins over and over, you know, it was these small kind of hits. I was both, in a way, the worker, the essential worker, but also the author of this heroes work here narrative, right? I myself being part of a microcosm of kind of greater American society. This work also in the show very much related to the Capitol insurrection in January. You know, it seemed to me a turning point in our country. I think in a lot of ways, it was difficult to watch. You know, I would remember turning C-SPAN on that day and thinking, oh, this should be some shenanigans, and then that happening and really just kind of being overwhelmed with it. And this idea that these kind of great notions of our country, these kind of highfalutin philosophical ideas, you know, are maybe failing, you know, maybe falling apart, maybe crumbling. But even so, even if they are dead, you know, the fight to kind of resuscitate them and keep them alive is a fight worth fighting. And something that I, you know, am deeply, I'm a deep proponent of. Just a few other works related to the recent events as well. This piece, Good Enough for Who It's For, a series of 50 clay N95 masks and just a couple gloves in each one, right? There was a number of instances in which expired PPE had been sent out to hospitals and healthcare workers, and if there was a detail in this image, you could see that the glaze on the ceramic is really kind of nasty and grotesque and dripping. Similarly, this work about kind of mask wearing becoming a political issue, how this kind of simple act to help preserve, you know, the collective has been superseded by the desire for personal freedoms. And that's all I got.
All right, well, at this point, we have a little bit of time for questions. And I don't think that there's a mic, so just say it and we'll repeat it back for those of you that are streaming. And then just also a quick reminder that Quinn is performing in the gallery right after this at 6 p.m. So we're all gonna go up there, and if we don't get to all the questions, we'll be at the reception, so just come find us and we can chat one-on-one. Oh, and that if you are streaming, Quinn's performance is being streamed as well, and the link to that live stream is in the description of this live stream. So you can just check that out so you don't miss a beat. All right, thank you. And are there any questions? Yeah.
How did you intend for people to view your guys' work on first glance?
Our personal work? Okay, so the question was, how do we intend for people to view our work at a first glance, our personal work?
I think with a kind of cursory overlook for my own work, I hope it does kind of speak to this kind of at least content of American nationalism, maybe in a certain sense. I think specifically when I'm thinking about the piece "Death, Breath, Resuscitation" or the final piece I showed, that there's inherently tied to the symbol of the American flag and the symbol of the Gadsden flag, which is the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, that are immediately recognizable. And then I'm hoping that within the context of that kind of, all right, we've placed it. We've placed the work. Now let's delve deeper into like what is contextually related in the piece, right? So the body bag, right? So immediately we're thinking like, there's a flag, there's a body bag. What is happening there? Or the masks, right? And the kind of warning lamp. So I think specifically with those works, and definitely not all of my work, but specifically those, I'm hoping that upon initial glance, there's some evidence that the work is about American national identity, as well as hopefully there's at least enough information there that someone can kind of quickly take those things and add them up to some sort of commentary or question.
Yeah, same. I no. Well, I think I think what Eric hit on is it's about layering, right? It's about having enough to the work that you have something that initially draws you in, right? Like I'm using some pretty clear American iconography, like really obvious use of, color, president faces, heads that we've seen a million times before, but those kinds of things that offer you enough of recognizability so that you feel like you can automatically relate to it, but then also like sneak in another layer of meaning, or like use those things that are really relatable to open a conversation to the point that you want to make, which I think maybe Eric was talking about too. And I think a lot of the work in the show is very layered in that there are a lot of sort of covert things happening, that you get pulled in with something like, oh, I know what this is about. And then, you spend a little time with the work, and hopefully you start making some discoveries. So I think also too, part of making artwork that is engaging is anticipating your viewer and saying, thinking like, what are they going to bring to the piece too, right? When they see it. So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Which came first, the attraction to the artist or the idea for the show? Okay, so the question was, which came first, the attraction to the artist or the idea for the show? I mean, kind of simultaneous, I would say.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, Brie and I were in graduate school together, and inevitably we're having these conversations about kind of the trajectory of, specifically for us at the time, thinking of kind of, our backgrounds, ceramics, but then more broadly, since we kind of work both interdisciplinarily, about the ways in which, work is kind of utilized to, describe and hold narrative. And, some of the artists that are in the show, we were discussing back and forth. And I think as we developed the desire to put on this exhibition, those artists were kind of intermingling within that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I also want to point out too that, I mean, while this was a show that was initially crafted for a proposal to NCECA, which is the big ceramics conference that happens every year, I mean, a lot of the work is not clay-based, and it is sort of a living exhibition in that, like, we already showed the work once online. This is the first physical iteration of the show, and it has shifted a little bit. So, like, the artists gave us different work. One artist swapped out because the last iteration she couldn't do this show, and it's something that we hope to keep adding to and evolving as it goes to different places. Also thinking about, you know, Richmond as being the original site, and thinking about artists' work who might have something to say in Richmond. I mean, other places as well, but again, that site specificity is something that's really interesting to consider when putting a show together. And I guess the other thing I'll say too is that, like, you know, I've curated shows as a curator, but we are also in this show, so we're kind of more organizers than curators. Like, we're a part of it as well. And I think as you think about ways to push your careers forward, you know, those of you going into the arts, like, also craft an opportunity for yourself and for others as well. Like, putting these shows together, it's an opportunity to really build relationships. Like, we have working relationships with all of these artists now, which is totally awesome. Like, that's what it's all about, is making connections with people all around the country and saying, hey, I really like your work, let me give you a platform to show it 3-4 times if I can. And you've opened up so many doors, right? So for us as both artists and curators, I think, like, when you get to wear both of those hats, really exciting things can happen. So yeah, I think it was all sort of like synergy happening at once.
Yeah.
Talking about the origin of Richmond intrigued me because historically, the first state to secede was South Carolina. Richmond and Virginia came later, and the capital of the Confederacy moved to Richmond after being somewhere else further south. What made you choose to have Richmond be the symbolic start of what you want to focus on?
All right, so the question was the complicated history of the Confederacy, not originally starting in Richmond, Virginia, but in South Carolina. What made us pinpoint Richmond as sort of a focal point for the show? And I mean, the very easy answer is just that that's where the conference was happening. You know, so we originally proposed the show knowing that it was going to be in Richmond, Virginia. And you're absolutely right. And I don't necessarily think it makes too much of a difference with the curatorial concept, you know what I mean? But I think that's a nice point. I think we very well could have researched venues in South Carolina, you know, to propose the show, but it was more of just a structural thing. Like, that is where the Confederacy ended up, and that's where the open proposal is for.
And I also think, in relation to that, yes, that's kind of right. The Confederacy ended there. That was its, like, final home base during its defeat. But also, Richmond has such a complicated history because of that, right? I think many of us have probably heard of Monument Avenue, right? Where so many of the monuments there are reflective of that Confederate history and really problematic in a number of ways, and are now being addressed, like we saw in some images earlier with the Robert E. Lee statue. Not soon enough, obviously. But I think it was such like a kind of potent place, and, right, the NCCA conference was there, and that's where the Confederacy ended. So it felt it felt like a great place to exhibit works that we thought, you know, were offering alternative narratives, whether about our histories or, you know, our kind of future histories, or our present.
I think we probably have time for one more question, and then we should go on upstairs if anyone has something. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to how where you live has influenced your work, like your place of residence? You talked a little bit about, like, the North Dakota thing and the Mount Rushmore. Can you expand upon that, both of you, in your art practice?
Yeah, so great question. Asking about how where we've lived has influenced our practices. Do you want to go first, Eric?
Sure. You know, I think the work specific to this show, when I'm thinking about kind of my place and my own locale, historically, you know, I've lived I spent most of my time in Ohio, which is a very split state in terms of maybe not necessarily values. I think values are pretty transcendent, whether we want to believe that or not. But at least in kind of political, in the political realm. And, you know, that's a place I'm always interested in because of that. Because I've seen, you know, it's very evident to me that there is this divide in our country that needs to be addressed one way or another. Because, you know, I see it in my neighbors. I see it in people I know. You know, I also think there's something to be said about my general practice in terms of both kind of almost endurance style performances. For instance, the performance where I kind of picked through that clay pile for all the pins. That was a 20-hour performance, as well as just being a ceramic maker. Oftentimes, you know, there's this kind of Midwest Protestant work ethic that I feel I almost have to live up to. I don't believe in it. I, you know, sometimes kind of despise it, but I definitely feel like the labor I put into work is somehow valuable. Even though I don't believe, like, you know, I think a piece that's put together in 5 minutes can be just as potent as a piece that's 20,000 hours, right? But it's ingrained in me, you know. I'm a good Midwestern boy.
You sure are.
Thanks, Brie.
Yeah. For me, I mean, I think that moving around the country and living in different parts of it has, I mean, completely changed my work. I mean, I grew up in Vermont, which is as blue a bubble as you can get, you know, and, you know, went to school in a really liberal spot in New York. And then I moved to Nebraska, which is very different, you know, and the experience that you get when you travel, I mean, you don't necessarily have to live in different parts of the country, right? But when you travel around, you start being like, oh, okay, like these are the folks who voted for so-and-so. You know what I'm saying? Like, you start really understanding how freaking vast this country is and how varied the folks are. And that's just one of the reasons why I think it's so important to do a lot of traveling. But yeah, even you know, we both went to grad school at Ohio University, which is just 3 hours from here, right? Like Appalachia. Again, a totally different part of the country for me. And, you know, we dug into the history of, you know, company towns and mining and clay factories. And that was really, you know, that was really influential on me. Before I went to grad school, I was making really personal work, you know, talking about, you know, struggle with mental illness and stuff like that. But the political landscape changed really radically in 2016. And so I think having hopped around to different parts of the country in the midst of that made me feel very compelled to make work that was more politically potent. So I really kind of did a 180 from looking inward, which is obviously a totally valid practice. I did it for a lot of years, to looking outward because there was just too much for me to ignore, right? So yeah, I mean, and especially, you know, I guess my last little bit is like, travel as much as you can and, you know, go make connections with a lot of, with people all over the country, because that's really how you start to get to the core of what the sort of American identity is all about. Yeah. Anything else, Eric?
No, I think maybe in regards to that question, you know, I would say if you have the impetus to make work that touches on kind of grand ideas, look for those grand ideas in the local.
Yeah.
You know, I am culpable of not doing that, and sometimes I wish I was better about doing that. So I always think that when you can kind of localize a subject, it becomes much more powerful. And, you know, thank you all for coming to the talk, and I hope you've enjoyed the show. And thank
Yeah,
you, Brie, for being such a wonderful
No,
partner
thank
to
you,
work with.
Eric.
No,
Yeah, and if
thank
you have any other questions, we're all going upstairs now, so you can just come find one of us. And if you haven't followed these artists, give them some love. And we really appreciate y'all being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.